I have to get this out immediately because the Cyrene bug situation is going out of hand, guys, right? So if you guys have seen our previous video over here, they need to fix this Cyrene bug ASAP with breaking news, right? Before the Yao got this is basically taken from the Reddit post from this over here, which is 1 day ago, slightly longer than 24 hours, with roughly 4.3k upvotes and all that kind of stuff. But apparently, it is not a bug. So it is my duties as the HSR guy to get to the bottom of this situation on whether or not this Cyrene bug is a bug or not a bug. And I'm sure some of you guys as a little seen, right, this bug is unacceptable, blah, 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 blah. But we are also getting another couple of things which apparently it is not a bug. It is stupid design, blah, 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 blah. Okay, we're just gonna jump into the response situation from Reddit, right? So we've seen this original post by now. If you want to see exactly what is a Cyrene bug, check out our previous video. It goes down exactly what's going on. But then, there is a hidden contender. From Mr. Series as the OP, we have Dead Paradise. Response post. Cyrene is not bugged. A response to the misinformation being spread, right? So this is a response to Lycevians of this over here found here. I will try to make this as fast as possible because it's midnight. So I guess this post was roughly slightly under 16 hours from now. I apologize for any inaccuracy, blah, 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 blah. There's one exception to what I will say, which is Sunday. He has a mechanic. Okay, nobody cares about Sunday, so let's move on. Let's first start. Okay, let me zoom in a little bit. The difference between Mimo sprites. So Netherwing and Ika, they are on field and you can in fact target them, right? This is effect W, right? This is effect. Ika can be targeted by enemies. This is effect. But Netherwing, you have to choose a target with a skill, but the enemies cannot physically target Netherwing. This is also effect. Netherwing, can I just call him Pollux? Pollux can't be targeted, but he can still lose HP if your team loses too much HP, right? I think we also know this by now. So let's move on. What makes Cyrene's Mimo sprite different? Demi-Urge is considered a state out of bounds, and this is unique to only Demi-Urge. No other Mimo sprites have this, so you cannot target them, and the enemies can't either, but they are still on the team and on field. So even though this says out of bounds, it is still considered as on field. So Demi-Urge is not a target and never can be. This is an intended functionality. As we have seen from the certain words, the word target is used for certain buffs, but Demi-Urge is not a target. The one exception, which is Sunday, being made mechanically different. So if you bring up Pollux, then you should know that Pollux is a different type of target class called a backup, where the team covers them from being hit. So out of bounds can't be targeted by allies or enemies, but backup can't be targeted by enemies, but you can still target your backup with your original team, right? You can try it with Mimi yourself. Mimi can target your Netherwing, pull bro up, all that kind of stuff, right? So how do you tell which buff should apply to Cyrene's Mimo sprite? So there are two buffs, zone and team buffs, as well as target buffs. So this is, I believe we are all familiar with Ranmei, with Tribi, with T, right? All those are zone buffs, right? You don't have to apply to anyone specifically. Everybody just gets it by the accident. Then target buffs are shared out Team Green, Brown, Cancer. You have to target them, right? Your Savidra, your Sparkle, target them to actually get a buff. So for example, I will use Sparkle because she has an example for all. Her main buff is a target buff, but her light cone is a zone buff, right? Okay, so it's blah 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 blah. The important distinction over here is that the turn counts down when a unit that applies the buff takes turn. As I've said before, Demi-Urge is a teammate, but Demi-Urge cannot be targeted. So this is an important wording choice over here because these zone buffs are often identifiable by conditions rather than turns like Ranmei or skill. So very important. Now, if you compare this to the target buffs, this is Sparkle's base skill, right? So if you use the skill, pull up, crit damage buff, 1.9, all that kind of stuff. If you get Demi-Urge on the field after Cyrene, I don't use the skill on Demi-Urge, it will not apply because you are buffing Cyrene. This is a fact. This is a fact because you know by now, Sunday's mechanic as a skill, he intentionally buffs both the user and the summon. This has been since 2.7, but a lot of other buffers, such as your Bronya, Sparkle, Tingui, they only buff the wearer, which is why when Sunday was announced, it is gonna be a lot better than your other hyper carry supports because your Bronya, Sparkle, they cannot target the summons. because they can't apply, right? The only tool that can actually do this is technically RMC, because RMC's Mimi does this at the exact same wording as well as Sunday, right? So this is why Sunday gets annoying for this explanation. But when you look at damage stat screen, you won't see any countdown buffs because the targeted buffs are characterized by countdowns, blah, 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 blah. Cyrene gets the buff, but not damage. Exceptional. So using Sparkles out as an example, she grants allies a buff called Cypher, but you may notice that out only appears on target allies. And since damage is out of bounds, i.e. she cannot be targeted by Sparkles buffs, therefore she also will not gain Cypher. Even though the out in the Sparkles kit never says target, you can know because the ultimate has a turn cooldown. So in fact, if you do this with your light cone equipment and go to damage, you will see that the Sparkle signature effect, but not Cypher. Cypher is not the car, Cypher is the Sparkle's ultimate, right? So not Sparkle's ultimate. Zone buffs are tied to the buffer rather than the turns of the target being buffed. So debunking the statements made. So this all that, right? All this is the yap. If you want to skip the yap, you can just come down to this 7 over here. Is this a bug or not a bug from this original post? And there it is. Number 1. MOC buff, right? So you can see the MOC buff is this dude and someone gain a 40% damage bonus over here, right? All that, right? This is the original post. Looking at this wording, you would think this would be a bug, but however, it is absolutely abhorrently worded for a buff. In fact, the way it is worded feels like a buff, right? I'm sorry, feels like a bug. However, it is likely that this mechanically working as a target buff and not a zone buff, right? So the wording the devs use are not communicating this mechanic. It is likely a wording oversight rather than a bug. It is a wording issue, not a mechanic issue. Okay, so before I even go on to the rest of the post, right? My question is, how do you know that? How do you know this is a wording issue and not a mechanic issue? Because we take everything as per face value because this entire premise of all this on being a bug or not a bug is based on their wordings, right? So if we are going to be taking everything based on what HSR's kit description says, which is using the abilities based on the words, then why all of a sudden this is suddenly a wording issue and not a mechanic issue? So that's my first question, right? So let's just move on a little bit. Arcadia. I think this was one of the biggest red flags on whether or not Cyrene herself is a bug. Because if you take a look at Arcadia's wording, they literally say the exact same wording as her own two-piece planner that we just got, right? So this is just blah, 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 blah. Let's take a look at the wording of Arcadia more fully to understand why the buff does not apply. So blah, 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 can read it for yourself. The issue that the original post ran into is that they did not account for out of bounds, which is if we follow the logic that I stated previously, however, they are not targetable. Then it makes sense because Arcadia states for one additional /mission ally target. And damage can't be targeted, right? Because this thing says target, and because damage can't be targeted, therefore Cyrene will not get the buff. So if you follow this mechanic, it is gonna be as per the wording over here because this thing says target, right? Is it utterly ridiculous? Yes, but apparently it is not a bug, right? So that's gonna be for Arcadia over here. And then lastly, we have Herta Show of Lycon as well as Victory in the Blink, blah, 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 blah. It has the same logic because this thing does in fact say ally target, right? This is gonna be ally target over here. Trust me, I still blah, 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 blah. So TLDR, it is a wording issue for MOC, as well as the wording for Arcadia specifically points out the target, which damage cannot be a target because she is out of bound. But even though she's out of bound, she is still on field, right? So that is the rebuttal. Yo, Adder, can you do like a objection? Objection! But alas, you thought this was it? We have a follow-up response. So the plaintiff strikes back the defendant with a follow-up response that Cyrene is actually bugged. So a response to the misinformation being spread. But luckily for us, this rebuttal, this response is very, very short, right? This is very, very short. So let's take a look. Going to keep this short and simple. The rationale by the previous user for why the set Arcadia and other effects with ally target don't apply to Cyrene is flawed. So this guy is basically saying everything that he's saying over here, like this entire chunk over here, like all this explanation, right? All this explanation, like Sparkle example, blah, 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 going into Arcadia, it is flawed. it is wrong. Bro is talking out of his ass, right? The simple answer is that Cyrene is bugged and is inconsistently counting or not counting as an ally target. The most glaring example is here's E2. Come sit in my courtyard. The exact text is, when an ally target's HP decreases, speed increased by 30%. Visibly in-game, after Hyacinth's Lycon drains Cyrene's HP, the effect is also applied to damage. So because of Hyacinth's Idolin 2 does in fact have this word over here, right? The target. So the previous rationale of this whole allies targeting, right? Ally targets, it is completely thrown out the window, because why would Hyacinth's Idolin 2 with the exact same wording apply to damage but not the previous, right? Not the previous. The same thing is going to be said for Arcadia. This is ally target, right? So if you want to compare wording to wording, right, using wording as a justification as to opposed to a bug, then you can see that the argument falls apart super fast, because this is the exact same wording for Hyacinth's Idolin 2, except damage still gets it. So for the conclusion to be that damage is not considered an ally target, this effect would not work. So yes, Cyrene is bugged, since otherwise this effect should not work on her Mimo's right? So that is the counter to the defendant saying whether or not this is bugged or not bugged. But wait, we have one more. The response from OP. Let Hoyo know about the Cyrene bug. It is an argument of semantics. So this is the second final response to basically see if Cyrene is bugged or not bugged. OP of the initial bug post. So this is the Lycirenes, the guy that started everything, right? This is the guy that started everything, right? I'm making a follow-up post because I have been there to do this post that breaks down the difference between the zone and blah, 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 blah. I'm here to show you the inconsistencies and why it shouldn't work this way and report this to Dawei himself, right? So if a plain common sense reading of text leads you to expect one result and the mechanics of the game are producing a different one, is the mechanics that are wrong. File those bug reports. So bro is gonna go into the technical details. So the first argument was that Arcadia shouldn't work because of out of bounds, but Amphorius does activate, and the difference is targetability, right? There are buffs that apply especially on targets and buffs that act as zones. So from this over here, this is on the field, this is on the field. This is not targeted, and this is select, right? So both Arcadia and Amphorius have pretty much the same thing. The only issue lies on a unit is targetable or not targetable. But this is not dependent on the word target, because as you can see from Hyacinth's E2, you can in fact still get this 30% speed buff, but you are not getting the same thing for Victory in the Blink as well as Arcadia, right? So this is the differences on whether or not this thing exists should not be the final semantics of whether or not you are gonna be existing as a mechanical failure or a wording error, right? So that's gonna be that. And now we're gonna move on into the light cone differences, right? Targeted works on. So the bro basically make like a very cute little PowerPoint summary infographic to kind of see that the representation between different light cones as well, whether or not this effect is going to be given to Cyrene, so people are saying that aura buffs, which is basically like your team-wide, you know, the zone buff, or the aura buffs doesn't have a timer, and that zone buffs do. Except that is not the case either. In Cyrene's entire list of buffs, you will see a lone buff with a timer. So this is actually zone buff. Cyrene doesn't have this, and then this is where we do get the 2 turns remaining on Hyacinth's E2. Right, this is a Hyacinth's E2 and a buff without a timer that she is not receiving. So now you can make an argument that she has an exception to work with Hyacinth E2 just like Sunday. So he's saying that maybe Hyacinth E2 is an exception, but is not enough, right? And that the MOC buff is actually a target buff without a duration, and the only that's not bug, and every bug that ever exists in HSR can be explained away as intended. But so this is the part where the technical details come to an end. I think that is beyond the point, bro. Plain diff is about to slam on right now. A bug is when the outcome does not match your expectations. It is not a bug in the code because the code does what it says, but a bug in the gameplay because it's completely contrary to what any of the buffs are saying. Is why I call it a bug, but there's an endless debate on semantics. Okay, semantics is basically wording. phrasing? How do you represent your points? That's semantics, right? And whether or not it's mechanics or whether or not it's a bug, that has nothing to do with what the actual representation is. It's just plain and simple. Is this a bug? Is this working as intended? Yes or no, right? It is not worth spending time arguing about. If there's one thing we can all agree on, is that it should not work like this. And I think that we can all agree, like, why is Arcadia not working on Cyrene? It just does not make sense, right? Like, you just ask, okay, if you have skipped the past 15 minutes, just ask yourself a very simple question, right? Arcadia's entire set, the existence, the wording for Arcadia, you can just see over here, it is literally kind of just bait for either Finon or your Remembrance units. Like, you can just say that as it is. Because this is inclusive of when you have additional units, which is pretty much gonna be from the Remembrance units when you're playing Enforcers, right? It is just plain and simple, right? So the fact that Cyrene don't work with this, when it literally has Mimi's face up in there, there's something wrong here, right? There's definitely gonna be something wrong here. So that's gonna be that. Not worse than anyone. If there's one agree, is everyone agrees that working like this is just plain dumb. If the game says allies get a buff, allies should get a buff. We shouldn't be limited by an old framework design back in 1.0 before we had concepts like Mimo sprites and out of buff. So TLDR, considering that it is literally Cyrene's banner, and this MOC is literally having a buff that buffs any of your summons, Cyrene should receive this buff, right? It is very simple. Because why would you release a unit that don't gain the rate up environment when every single shield environment in HSR has always benefited the shield unit? It is simple, no semantics, it is just black and white, right? So that's gonna be plain and simple. Despite the complaints, Hoyo marketed her E1 as an item for her own damage. They are drastically hurting her performance, which is why I made this post. So who had saved all of, okay, so this part, I think it's getting a little bit more emotional, right? This is personal emotion. He saved all of 3.x and spent and cost on a DPS Cyrene team. Sorry, we randomly attribute to all of our buffs as zone of target with no in-game explanation of what these concepts are, completely wrong word description, and no way to make sure that they are besides testing case by case. It is not an acceptable reply from Hoyoverse. Forget zone or target, file a bug report. Let Hoyo know. Tell them that Cyrene doesn't work with MOC, with Arcadia, and with Herta Icon. Our units shouldn't be doing worse because that's how it's coded. If you think Hoyo doesn't care about bugs, they have patched the Aventry bug, which has been proven to be a bug, by the way. Shout out to I'm in Flame Chase, I'm in Flame, Red Flame. He actually made a video from like it was the one where the computer programmer talks about how Aventry's bug does not work, right? Because we basically do not get the additional shield because of Mimo's right? They have patched a bunch of more bugs just in 3.7. This is a bug. Share this. It needs to be shared. Make it an issue. Report the bug. Bug report. And there it is. Absolute cinema. And finally, just when you thought everything has come to an end, the final response for Cyrene is, this is the final response, right? This is the definitive final response. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed this right as much as I have, right? I think this is one of the most interesting little situation we have seen from a very long time on whether or not Cyrene is bug, right? So word of the day is going to be bug or no bug. Yo, chat, type 1 if you think this is a bug, type 2 if you think this is not a bug. 1 if it's a bug, 2 if it's not a bug. 1 if it's a bug, 2 and there it is. And there it is, right? And there it is. Yo, editor, zoom in on all that. Zoom 43311. And there it is. Okay, chat, like this. It is a bug. That's a possibility of getting Stellar Jades and pools. I'm just saying, right? Okay, bye-bye.